photographer based in Los Angeles. His recent writing, producing, and editing work includes programs for IFC and the History Channel. And his film work has taken him all over the world, and his photography has been exhibited in galleries from Paris to New York to Los Angeles. Mr. Miller lives in Studio City, California with his wife of 45 years who is with us tonight, costume designer Carol Ramsey. So we're happy to have you here. His story tonight will take us to the infamous Confederate prison, Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia, and will detail how an intrepid group of Union prisoners made the greatest escape. So please welcome Douglas Miller.
Thank you very much. It's a great turnout. This is fun. My wife and I just had an interesting journey. We just went to Richmond because that's where the story takes place. And it was the 160th anniversary of the escape a few weeks ago. And so we went to Richmond and we did a walk and talk of the sites where it happened. And you go to like this site where there's nothing there. But you can stand right here, as I did, and hold up a picture to show people where the prison was. And because there was a lot of great images and stuff. And so we started, all that's really left now, this is a plaque, a couple plaques that they've had around there. This is a view, literally, of the site today. There's not much to see. It's very interesting, though. Right here is a Virginia Holocaust Museum. Right next, the prison would have been on both sides of this seawall. It's a seawall they built because the James River flooded so often. It used to flood then. And there wasn't even a street here. It was just all lake. So the prison would have come right down to here. This is a site. This is what we brought people to. It was very interesting, and this is another, on the site, they have, as part of the plaque, they have this funny little model here that you can see. And one thing I'll point out now, because it's going to matter later, is notice how the building is built into a rising thing, so that it's 4 stories on this side, but it's only 3 stories on this side. This is going to be important, because when you want a tunnel, you got to get some place to get underground. So this is the front, and this would have spaced the river, really. Now here I am talking about it, showing a picture down there, and we had to scout over the railroad line. And but we had a great turnout, fun stuff. This guy's one of the main park rangers there. He was there to turn to hear his comments, see if he agreed with me on things. But we had a great time, and we got to retrace the whole steps where the thing happened. And what's interesting, one of the things to know about Libby is this escape at the time was incredibly famous. It was so famous in the decades after the Civil War that this entire building, this is heavy-duty stone, this is not brick, this is built with big blocks. They took this entire building apart. They put it on railroad cars, they took it to Chicago and set it up as the Libby Prison Civil War Museum. Like here's a picture of it, right? It says Libby Prison as it is now, but that was in the 1880s before they literally removed this entire thing. They took it to Chicago, they set it up as a museum and filled it with tons of artifacts. Wow. And you could go in, here it is, no stranger. I was noticing nobody used the word stranger anymore. We would say, hey stranger, come to Disneyland. But anyway, no stranger should leave Chicago without visiting the prison museum, the only museum of the kind in America. 50 cents, and you could go down below and see where the supposed escape, which is just literally a hole in the wall, where the escape had supposedly happened. But it was very popular. If you've ever read the book, I know many have, The Devil in the White City.
Oh yeah.
This was there. This museum would have been just next to the White City at that time. It was profiting for people coming to the World's Fair. They came here, and get this. This is the prison, just this part back here. This is an entire facade they built all around the thing with stone. Anyway, it was very popular. It was there for decades. And here's another one of the, back then everything was in pamphlets. Also some perils and suffering of certain of its inmates. The story of Libby Prison. A thrilling history of the famous underground tunnel of Libby Prison by Captain Frank Moran, who actually did write one of the best accounts. Another one. From Rat Hell to Liberty. There's a good title. And again, there's the real, as you can see, Libby Prison, it says here, but it filled 2 blocks. Now, after the turn of the century, people weren't as interested, attendance fell off, so this is gone too. It was all distributed, so everybody asks where Libby Prison is. Well, it's all over Chicago. Beams and stone and stuff is all over, went into all kinds of other buildings. The Chicago Historical Society has some relics that they have, that they kept, from up there. But the prison itself is long gone.
What streets were it on in Chicago?
Between 16th and 14th on Wabash Avenue. I can't believe I remember that.
That's in the bottom.
But that's where it was. And I've never been there, I don't know. But down in the basement for an extra quarter, this is what you got to see. It opened the door, and I guess that's it. That's it. That's the hole in the wall. But, it sounded big at the time, and it was so popular. Here's Captain C.C. McCabe. This is an ad for him talking about the museum. It's interesting, all these other ads. Eat Gunther's candy and be happy. But his acclamation is great. It says, perhaps the best known soldier confined within the grim walls of Libby Prison during the late war was Captain C.C. McCabe. Those confined in Libby during his time there will never forget his inspiring songs and cheerful words. Captain McCabe, now a resident of New York City, and since the close of war, thousands have heard his graphic lecture on the bright side of Libby Prison. This guy literally traveled the country saying it wasn't so bad. We all had Christian fellowship, and we all got together and we sang songs. He must have given that 1,000 times. He traveled to Chautauqua Circle, he traveled all over the country, all kinds of Methodist sites. He was very famous for this. But he'd almost died in Libby. He literally almost died of disease in Burma. It's amazing he survived. But anyway, but this was a big seller for him. So it says here, Chaplain McCabe has visited Libby Prison since its removal and pronounces it the grandest and most instructive museum in the world. So there you go. What else do you need to know, right? So to jump ahead, I have to move the story fast, but you guys are Civil War guys, so I don't have to tell you a lot of background. We can move pretty quickly here, but suffice to say, things in the Confederacy were not going well. At the time, my guys in my book ended up in Libby. Libby was a prison for the entire course of the war. It was this warehouse building that had been converted into a prison. It was nothing but gigantic rooms. And when they turned it into a prison, first it was a holding tank. They used to trade. But once the war got on, by 1864, as you guys probably already know, prisoner exchanges had ended. Neither side, vitriol had gotten so deep that neither side was trusting the other. And then finally, with black troops, the Confederates absolutely refused to trade black troops for white troops. And Grant in the U.S. said, well, then that's it. We're not going to trade anybody. We all are soldiers treated equally, or we're not going to deal with this. So the exchanges broke down. So guys went from thinking you got captured, you're sort of an inconvenience, and you'd be sent home, to I may die in this prison. Who knows when the war's ever going to end? So I'm showing this picture. This is a picture of the famous women's bread riot of Richmond, showing how bad things were in the Confederate capital. Women went on a riot, smashed out a whole part of the downtown area, and looted all the stores. The president, Jefferson Davis, our friend, came out, literally read them the riot acts, poured out a piece of paper, said, here's the riot act, you ladies don't disturb, these guys behind me are going to fire on you, and they dispersed, and that was the end of it. But it was a big deal. Everybody talked about it. It just shows how bad things had gotten in Richmond. So this is the situation that these guys are being made prisoners during. The South is running out of everything. They're in really bad shape, so they're not very inclined to do anything for their prisoners. So now getting captured in the Civil War was like getting captured, I guess, most any time. What impressed me most in the accounts I read was how everybody seemed to talk about how surprised they were. They were totally startled. It's something they had not thought about. They thought about getting shot. They thought about going home. They thought about all kinds, but they didn't think about being a prisoner. And they all remarked how startled they were to have this happen, and to suddenly be in the hands of the enemy after the incredible excitement of battle. You're suddenly to what? What's going to happen? Nobody knows. Prisoners and their experiences changed throughout the war. You know, they constantly were making changes. Neither side had real plans. Neither side was prepared to take on prisoners. Neither side knew what to do about them. And but the good thing about Libby, I may as well mention now, for me, for my story is, it was an officers' prison. Officers only. It was supposed to hold 500 prisoners. By the time of the escape, it held 1,200 prisoners. So they gave them nothing. They gave them, you know, very little food. But anyway, my point is that since they were all officers, they all could read and write well. That was one of the few total, you know, you had to be able to do that to be an officer in the Civil War. That's how you're going to communicate with everybody. Plus, back then, people were often more literate than people today. They did so much writing. They wrote letters all the time. You know, everything was about writing. So when I started to do this story, people often ask, you know, how did you pick this out of all the stories in the world? And I read the first account that I found, the first-person account in a Civil War magazine, and I was just blown away by it. I just couldn't believe how exciting and crazy it was, and how did I never heard of it? I'd never heard of this story. How did I not know about this? You know, the museum, none of those things were in any of the books that I'd ever read. So I started to look into it, and my wife, who's a costume designer, said, I got a film in Richmond. Do we want to go to Richmond? I said, let's go to Richmond, and I will do the research on this book. I'll be Mr. Mom, we had a 5-year-old daughter, and we brought her there and put her in the local elementary school, and I spent all my day researching, and the best part was, I was thinking about this as a film. I'm a filmmaker, I make historical documentaries, but I kept finding more and more of these accounts, because this was such a big deal. Over the decades, guys would give speeches, lectures, they were in books, there were articles, there were pamphlets. All these guys wanted to tell my part in the great Yankee escape. Here's what happened to me. And they all had different stories. And so these stories just were knocking me out. I just said I have to write as a book, and I want to build it on these stories because they're so interesting. And as I go along, I'll read some of the interesting quotes that I use. I wanted to really feature these stories front and center, because these people, I couldn't write it any better when they tell some of the things that happened to them. Plus, you can't make this crap up. I mean, these stories are amazing. So, back to being taken prisoner, essentially they're brought from all over the country, wherever they're captured. If their officers are separated from their men, and they're sent to Libby prison, this big stone thing, where they're first searched by the Confederates, who do everything they can to steal everything they can. And they have a book where they claim they're going to give their stuff back, but they never do. And everybody knows they're being robbed. And they go over them very meticulously, because that's all they had to do was rob these guys as each new group would come in. They call them fresh fish. That's what they called the new people into the prison, were the fresh fish. And this was called the scaling process. Now, the leaders of Libby prison were just like you'd imagine, two incredibly evil guys. This was one of them, taken later. They were both named Turner, just to make it confusing for us historians. One of them was literally a slave master. That's what he did. He worked on a plantation, putting slaves into line. Now they put him in charge of prisons. He basically was going to use the same techniques. And this other guy, named another Turner, who was the next level up. There were these two guys. Anyway, he looks like a nice guy. We don't know when this picture was taken, but I assume after the war. There are some prisoners. The point is, it's supposed to be hard to see prisoners being led into the black prison in the middle of the night, because prisoners would arrive any time of day, and they'd be walked in to the prison. Here's a good picture of it that was drawn by an inmate of prison who was actually confined there. Here's an interesting, now I think there's a side issue, but I knew you guys would like this. Here's the photograph of Libby, and this is supposed to be, we don't know for sure, this is supposed to be the two Turners down here, the commandants. These are tents for the guards. So this is how the picture was taken, but nobody would have ever seen this photograph, right? Because they had no reproduction. So there's the engraving of that same picture. That's how people would have seen that photograph. And if you had a cheaper publication with not much of a budget, you make a woodcut. So this is a woodcut of the exact same image. So these old trees are very interesting to look at, because that's how people would have experienced those kind of images in that day. So prisoners arrived are a pretty miserable lot. This is a drawing just of general prisoners. I don't even know if these are Yankees or Confederates. It's not identified in the copy of the picture I have. But you see, they're all very scrawny, very scruffy.
Sure.
So, and here's one of the only drawings we have of Libby on the inside. Like I say, it's not like you think of prisons with cells and individual rooms and kind of, this is a gigantic space where there are hundreds of guys in these rooms. They're just jammed in there, seat by galley, never let them outside. They're inside the building 24/7. It's freezing in the winter, it's hot in the summer, and there's almost no food. People are dying every day of disease, of starvation, of what they called the blues. Guys would just fade away. They would just become so depressed and so lethargic that they would just waste away. So every day there was a dead cart that would pull up and load up the dead and take them away. To this day, nobody really knows exactly where they all ended up. You went near the windows, you could get shot to look out or try to get a breath of fresh air for the Confederates outside. And I say in my book, Libby had some of the best people in the Union Army, because how do you get captured if you're an officer? You better be freaking brave. That's how you get captured. If you're leading your men, you don't get captured if you're back at your desk or you're behind the lines. So only the most intense, these guys in the prison, they're not only just guys young men trapped in a giant space, but they're all intense type A personalities, these people. Outside, they're probably the worst people in the Confederate Army, because anybody that's got it at all on the ball is out on the front lines. These are guys who can't do that, who can barely walk, or half retarded or whatever. That's why they're there. So they're illiterate, and they're guarding these guys. So it's an interesting contrast. Now here's just another interesting side issue. Have you ever seen this painting? Has anybody ever seen this painting, The Battle of Fredericksburg? I put it in because many people know it. It's in that famous American Heritage. It's a 2-page lead in that famous. Anyway, the guy who painted this, very interesting guy, was a prisoner that I used, and he wrote a book that was published before the war was over, filled with his own drawing. This guy was a Cuban American. He was raised in Philadelphia. He was a great drawer, so they put him in the balloon corps. So his job was to go up and sketch the Confederate positions. He got captured at Gettysburg. He goes into Libby and begins drawing. Here's his drawing of Confederate guerrillas in the prison. Here's his drawing of a future brigadier, meaning a high officer who's there washing his socks, which pretty supposedly about the low end of what you have to do. Here's his great drawing of a prisoner's dream, of a man in the prison dreaming of his reuniting with his family, which is something they always talked about. Here's a guy bargaining with one of the slaves who would clean the place. This is another slave who would go around with tar smoke and fill. That was their idea of fumigation. They fill the whole place with tar smoke. They probably accomplished nothing, but it was something to do. Here's this picture of a thing of cornbread with a candle in it, and he writes in his book about staring at that, thinking, that's maybe breakfast.
What's his name, Cavada?
Oh yeah, Cavada, named Frederick Cavada. And so he's a real interesting, important person who has a lot to say and has these great drawings. And so I just thought you folks would be interested in seeing some of his drawings. And we'll talk about him more later. And then there's one more person I want to set up for you, and that is Elizabeth Van Loo. I don't know how many of you are familiar with her, but she's an important player. This is her after the war at her mansion in Richmond. She had a mansion in Richmond. This is another picture of it. And she was one of the wealthiest persons in Richmond. And I'll just read a quick page here how I introduce her in the book if you don't know much about her. But from the garden of her magnificent home atop Church Hill, Miss Elizabeth Van Loo could look down on the grim POW staggering into Libby prison a few blocks away. In other words, her living for a yard, she could look down and see the prison. Church Hill was where many of Richmond's wealthy lived, and it provided a commanding view of the city below. For decades, the columned Van Loo mansion had been a social and political destination for the South's elite. John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, had been a regular. Elizabeth had seen Edgar Allan Poe read The Raven to guests in the drawing room. Just a few blocks away stood famous St. John's Church, where 77 years earlier Patrick Henry had declared, "Give me liberty or give me death." Elizabeth's father had been a successful hardware merchant. She grew up amid splendor and slaves. The family rode about Richmond in an expensive carriage pulled by 6 white horses. Everyone in Richmond knew the Van Loos. When the war began, Elizabeth was in her 40s, short, scrappy, and full of energy. In her youth, she had been considered a beauty, but that was fading. She never married, and they claimed she had a terrible breakup with a young man when she was younger. Her neighbors knew her as an intense, independent soul. They knew she had gone so far as to deliver food and books to the hated Yankee POWs in the city. As a result, she was shunned by upright Southerners, but was otherwise left alone with her eccentricities. Who cared what some aging spinster thought about politics or war anyway? But what the Confederates in their capital city did not know was that by the middle of 1863, Elizabeth Van Loo had already developed the underground network that would make her the most effective spy master of the Civil War. From her estate overlooking Libby prison, Van Loo ran an intensely loyal group of informers, spies, slaves, ex-slaves, and saboteurs. Like her, they were lifelong Richmonders who had refused to give up their faith in the United States. They lived among slavery, and they hated it. In his 1996 study, The Secret War for the Union, Edwin Fishel called Miss Van Loo's efforts, quote, "the most productive espionage operation of the war, performed by either side." By the end of the war, Van Loo's ring was so efficient that her encrypted reports were being delivered across Union lines almost daily, often wrapped around a fresh rose cut from her garden. So that's Elizabeth Van Loo. She's an amazing character. This is her house again. It's interesting that it was considered one of the best houses of the city, but she was so hated after the war that when it was deeded to the city tore it down and replaced it with this elementary school. And she was so despised. After the war, the movement became, the Richmonders particularly hated the idea that she led a whole ring of Richmonders. And so they tried to peg her as a solo spy. They called her the lone vixen, crazy bet, all these things to denigrate her. They didn't want to let on that actually in their own city, their own people had undermined the war effort. And anyway, so there's where her house was. There's a plaque about her right here. And where I told you I put my daughter in a school, it was this school. I did not know. I had enrolled her in a school where Elizabeth Van Loo lived. We were just down the hill from there. I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing. So anyway, and this is a view from, there's a school but looking down the hill. This would have been her garden right here. And so she can see it. It goes all the way down to the river. That's why the rich people lived on Church Hill. You had this beautiful view of the city and the river. So one of the most important stories, there's a nice photograph of her. One of the most important stories you may have well heard is that she's still controversial. It'll always be controversial because we don't have the hard facts. But there's very strong evidence that she had a slave in the Confederate White House, a slave who could read and write, a slave who had we don't know about the photographic memory part, but it's talked about that. That woman worked at the table, was there at dinner time, and it's because, the wealthy talk to the wealthy, and Mrs. Davis went to Miss Van Loo and said, it's hard to get good help these days, can you recommend somebody? She says, well, I have this slave. Didn't tell her she could read and write, which was illegal. But Van Loo had sent her north before the war to be educated. And then she went to, there's a whole crazy story, she went to Liberia and Africa as a missionary, hated it, came back, but she couldn't, in Virginia, if you were manumitted, if you were free, you had to leave the state. And that's why they did it, because almost nobody wanted it. You know, it was a horrible thing. You had to leave everybody you know. So she came back, said, I want to be a slave again. So they went to court. Elizabeth Van Lew said, yes, he's still my slave. They said, okay. So she ended up in the Confederate White House. Here's the Confederate White House. Nobody knows if this story is true, but we do know this. Elizabeth Van Lew provided such incredible information to the North that when the war, at the very end of the war, the first thing Grant did when he got to Richmond was go to her house with his wife to have tea with Elizabeth Van Lew.
Wow.
And with Elizabeth Van Lew, when he heard she was having financial troubles, he became president. He appointed her the most plum job he could in Richmond, which was postmistress of the city.
Wow.
Very controversial. The Confederate Southerners hated it. Grant didn't give a shit. He said, oh, president, I don't care. You know, I don't care. So he kept her in there. He kept her there for 8 years.
Wow.
Until he was defeated. And she left. But anyway, the point is, she's getting incredible information from somebody, somewhere, and nobody really knows. You know, she sure didn't get it by sitting in her house all day. So she had these people going out. So anyway, it's a great story. Here's her, this is her code, her encryption code that she would use to send things. She was called Mr. Babcock in the messages from the Union when they would want to communicate with. This is another picture I do. I feel this was after the war. I'm not exactly sure when it was. So she's an important character of this thing because she's going to be helping these prisoners escape. She's got people all around. She's got people in Libby prison, naming slaves, who are feeding her information so she knows what's going on from these guys. And she can look at the prison from her place and see what's happening. Okay, so that's Elizabeth Van Lew. Now we get to the main guys in our escape story. Is this guy who gets capped. This guy's Colonel Rose. He's the hero of our story. He's the necessary man because this is a man completely obsessed with escape. That's all he talks about. His memoir has like the opening sentences, I ended up in Libby prison. The next sentence is, I soon set about finding a means to escape. And he also tried to escape on his way to the prison. And he said, they only caught me because I broke my ankle and they were able to run me down. But if not for that, I would have gotten away. So he gets into Libby with his friend Hamilton. They both get captured at Chickamauga. There's a number of Union, there's a huge number of Union soldiers captured at Chickamauga. The officers end up in here. They're all Midwesterners, and they basically, there's got to be a way out. There's got to be a way out. We can figure this out. I don't know what we're going to do, but we're going to figure this out. And so they set about doing it. And here, let me give you a little overview to give you a better sense of what they're trying to do here. And this is an overview of the prison. Okay, so here's the river, James River with a canal right next to it. This is why I showed you that picture. It looks this way. So the building is literally three giant rooms, 4 times. So 12 rooms. The basement rooms are empty and used for storage. This is looking at the basement. And this area here is so filthy and foul, it's called Rat Hill. Nobody goes down there. They store stuff in there, but nobody wants to go in there. And the men figure a way to get out. They say, we've got to get into this room. They try other things, nothing works. They say, if we can get into this room, I bet we could figure a way to get out of here. So, they have to get into this room because they're on a room above, and it's all sealed off. There's no way to get in it. The Confederates don't want anybody down there. So, what they do is, they find something as simple as this, a fireplace that's not used. The chimney is used. They have cook stoves around, and the chimney's there, but it's not. So, they're looking at that one day, and Hamilton, Rose's partner, says, he's a Mason. I mean a real Mason, not a History Channel Mason. So he says, we could take the mortar out of these things. I think we could get in there and get down to that room down there through the fireplace. So they spend night after night after night picking the different thing. They pick out all of that masonry, pull out all the bricks, set on the side, make a hole, because is going to slide down into the area below. And the point is, if you can see it here, this is a great drawing. I'll show you more of this picture, but this is what they're trying to do. This is key to the whole story, is that they, sorry. This is what they do. Here's the fireplace, there's the chimney, right? They start digging this out. They make an S-shaped curve to get into this catty-corner room. This is the hospital. This is the kitchen. This is rat hell. This is what they want. This is where they sleep. Upper 2 floors, the hospital, quote unquote. And this is how they get into rat hell, to start digging their tunnels. But I have to read the part where Rose describes being the first one down this path. And from now on, the only things I'll read will be sort of, or quotes, because they're just, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. But, okay. Rose attached the rope to a support post in the kitchen and began inching his way down. Now here's his story. Quote, I entered it feet foremost, at the same time seizing the rope. As soon as my feet and legs were dangling below, the inevitable law of gravitation forced my body into the hole as tight as a wedge. The fireplace was so narrow, and my body in such a position, that I could not use my arms, and of course I could not use my feet, so that I was perfectly helpless. Of all the tight places that I ever was in before or since, that took the lead. I whispered to Hamilton that I was wedged in so tight, I feared the whole Confederacy could not loosen me. And I said he was worse than stuck. His movements were making him slide down into the thing that was jamming his chest so he couldn't breathe. He was starting to suffocate. As his friend described, each effort only wedged Rose more firmly in the awful vice. Rose was grasping for breath and rapidly getting fainter, but even in the fearful strait, he refrained from an outcry that would certainly alarm the guards just outside the door. As Rose told it, he said, you have to, he tries to pull him out. He was a powerful man. He grabbed my left, this guy Hamilton grabbed Rose's wrist, grabbed my left wrist with both hands, while with my right hand I endeavored to help him. He pulled with the strength of a giant, but it was no use. I could not be budged an inch. He then left me sticking in the hole and ran upstairs. So he runs up. These guys sleep. There's so many of them, they have to sleep in rows. There's not enough. There's barely enough floor space for everybody. That's how tight they're jammed in there. But he has to try to find it. One of their cohorts, I also forgot to mention, nobody in the prison knows that they're doing this. You know, they have to keep it secret, not only from the guards, but from all the other prisoners. So this guy comes up, he says, you got to get me out of here. So he goes up running where all the men are sleeping and literally runs across it. Runs across the top of them, stepping on hands and feet and backs. People are yelling and throwing stuff at him. He finally finds somebody. They run down below and grab Rose by both arms. And as Rose describes it, as they gave another tremendous pull, I came up so light that we all three fell upon the floor with a prodigious noise. The sentinel who walked in front of the door seemed startled and confused. The prisoners upstairs called to each other to inquire the cause of the crash. We all three lay where we felt perfectly motionless and almost breathless. The corporal of the guard did not come into the room, and as soon as all was quiet again, we rose, replaced the bricks, the dirt, and the stove as quickly as possible, slipped upstairs, and went to bed, very much fatigued and considerably discouraged. So they get down there, they try this, that, they know that there's sewer lines, they try to get into the sewer lines flood, they almost drown, they stink up the prison such that the prisoners complain to the Confederates, why don't you guys do a better job of getting the sewage out of here, this place is horrible. But they don't realize they're doing this. But finally they start digging on a big hole outside, and the idea is, I'll show you here. Okay, here's a cross view of the prison, down on the ground floor with the guards. Here's, like I say, the kitchen, the hospital, and then the upper floors where the men actually sleep. And here's the way into rat hell, and now they're going to start digging this way, and the idea is to dig a tunnel out. There's an open lot, I'll show you in the next picture, on the side. It just so happens to be, there's a lot over there, and they start, And they start digging. So they start digging, they dig this hole. They describe it as 2 feet across, which I can't imagine. I mean, that's beyond claustrophobia. You can barely fit. You can only go, there's no supports. There's no thing to hold it up. If it collapses, you suffocate and it'll be forgotten. So you're digging this tunnel. It's just barely above your shoulders, this size. You start digging with, they have a little chisel, and they work at that. They work at that for weeks, digging it out, pulling the dirt out. The biggest problem is, once they get very far, is getting oxygen to the man, to the guy. And the guy would generally go in there with a little candle, work as long as he could till the candle went out, which means that all the oxygen is gone. And he had to slide out, he couldn't turn around. You had to inch your way out to get out. And if you passed out, they had to pull you out by your ankles, which often happened. Guys would run out of oxygen. The other thing is, the other guy would be there beating off the rats. That's what this guy's doing. This illustration. These are all old illustrations from all these amazing memoirs, I've found. So, here's a real tunnel now. Look at this. So, here they are on this side. This is this open lot. And over here is like a livery stable. So but nobody lives here. So this is not occupied at night, and that's key to the story, because they keep digging this thing under here, and they finally come up. And when they come up, the idea is, there's a fence here, right? So the idea is, if they can come up here, the Confederates can't see them. The guards won't be able to see them come up out of the ground. They come through this building, out this door, walk up this way, and head up this is be 21st Street in Richmond up to Carey Street. So that's the plan, such as it is, right? So,
Is that an air hole they put in the middle there?
yes. But I have to tell you, this map is totally accurate, but the only thing that's not right is this would have been here, in front of the thing. And the reason is, it wasn't an error thing, it was a mistake. They just put incredible effort in. The calculators were mathematicians, everybody was involved trying to figure out, how far is it from here to here? And when you're under, how do you decide how far it is? They have a huge argument about what to do. To this day, they still argue about whose fault it was. Anyway, they start digging up. They come up, not behind a fence, but up here. And this guy's description is amazing. Listen to this. Pardon my gum, I have a dry mouth thing. I have to keep trying to do stuff like that to stay ahead of it. So.
How did they, in the end, get into the rat room?
Well, that's what I said. They went through that fireplace, and they came in through here.
They must have made it.
Every night, they would take this fireplace apart, go down here, wait for the guards to shout. I think it was 3 a.m., and all's well, and they would go by, they would rebuild the fireplace, go upstairs, and go to bed. They did this for weeks. Confederates never caught on. This was the main entrance to the prison. It was right here. They had to walk past and see that. Nobody ever noticed that it was out of place, because they, worked so hard on it.
The first guy got stuck.
Huh?
First guy got
Yeah,
stuck.
first, but he got out, and then they widened it, and
Okay.
everything worked. It was very efficient after that. Yeah. So he was the first one, so he's the one that got stuck. But Rose was always in the lead. He was always like, I will take the hit. If there's somebody there going to arrest me, they're going to arrest me. I don't, I'm going to be the first man. So anyway, they're digging this hole. They decide to start digging up. Here's this one nice description of what happens. The guard, who would be probably wherever that guy was, the guard heard me burst through the surface, and he left his beat and came and stood right astride my face. The guy was down here with this hole looking up, and this guard comes and stands over him. He says, he stood right astride my face, leaned on the fence, and looked over into the enclosed yard. He thought the noise was from over the fence. He stood there, I suppose, for about half a minute. It seemed like half a century to me. Great drops of cold sweat stood out on my forehead. I couldn't breathe. The events of my life seemed to flit before me. I lived ages in that moment's time. But he did not see me and went away.
The same thing happened in The Great Escape in Germany.
Yeah.
What do you mean, in the movie or in the
No,
actual
real
story?
thing.
Yeah.
They
Sure, that part of
miscalculated.
Yeah. Of course, I know everything of the movie, which is almost entirely made up.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
Wasn't true?
Yeah, right. Steve McQueen on the motorcycle. That didn't happen.
The movie was accurate except for the motorcycle bit.
Except,
If you read the Paul Brick autobiography, he was there, he wrote about it, that's what the movie was made from. But McQueen insisted on the motorcycle.
well, they put all these Americans into the movie,
Yeah.
which weren't really there. So,
Yeah.
so many of the characters, they made it Americanized, which it wasn't, you know. Anyway, that's a different story. So, they're digging along, digging along. Here's my Frederick Cavada's drawing of things. Here's the fireplace, kitchen, the cellar. He calls these implements of war, right? Here's the important drawing, right? The entrance to the tunnel section and the shaft going over to the shed. So they finally get through. They plug up the hole. There's a whole dramatic moment where they come and tell Rose, it's all up, they caught us, it's all over, we'll never get away. And he says, chill out. I'm going to go down and check it out myself. He goes down there, he sees that there's a hole in the street, but nobody's noticed. So he comes and they put dirt and they put some clothing and they jam it up, and the Confederates never find the hole. So now they keep digging, they're still trying to get across, and what happens is Rose decides, this can't go on any longer. Nobody's going to finish it. I'm going to finish it. I'm the most, like I say, fanatical of everybody. So he announced he's going to take the chisel. He's not going to stop. And he's going to stay in there until he breaks through. So he digs and digs. He starts to run out of oxygen. It's so far away they can hardly get air to him. And here's how Moran, who I said has a great account, who was one of the escapees and knew Rose and talked to Rose and wrote this main article. Here's his description in great, I think, wonderful 19th century style, you know. His strength nearly gone, the feeble stream of air which his comrade was trying with all his might to send could no longer reach him. His senses reeled. He had not breath or strength enough to retreat backwards through his narrow grave. In the agony of suffocation, he dropped a dull chisel and beat his fist against the roof of his grave with the might of despair, when, blessed boon, the crust gave way and the loosened earth showered upon his dripping face. His famished eye caught sight of a radiant star in the blue vault above him. A flood of light and a volume of cool, delicious air poured over him. At that very instant, the sentinel's cry rang out like a prophecy. 1:30, and all is well. There's a drawing that accompanies it. It goes with it. Now Rose, so he goes through, he breaks through, he gets out. He goes out into the streets at night. He's the only one, he's by himself. He gets out, walks all the way around the prison, checks everything out, doesn't leave, comes back, goes back through the tunnel, goes back into the prison, and says, I decided it wasn't a good night to leave, because we want to have all night to get out. So we're going to do it tomorrow night. So he gets everybody there, and they get,
How many are
well, there's 1,200 people in the prison. There's a group of 30 that's going to try to get out, that's run this whole thing. The idea is we're going to get these 30 guys out, and then we're going to keep, every night we're going to run 30 guys out until the Confederates figure it out. That's the plan. So they get down there, they start going after the breakthrough. Now, you can't make this stuff up. So the prisoners, imagine this. The prisoners, they're up here, okay? They know something's going on, they don't know what's going on. However, they look out. They can see these guys coming out of the ground. Down the street. The guards cannot see that because they're on ground level. So up in the top floor, he says, they start running around. Everyone starts to run around saying, I'm going to go through that tunnel. They all start grabbing any kind of food they have. They grab their clothes. And they all, in a mob scene, they all start to come down towards the tunnel where the hole is in the basement. Now they have to do this in total silence. So there's a mob, a riot literally happening in silence. They're all jammed down there. It's pitch dark. They're jammed at this door. And there's one guy's description, from the upper floors, we could see the fugitives pop out of the tunnel, cross the yard, clear the gateway, and disappear in the dark. It was a glorious sight to see them pass out so cleverly from this hated prison. One felt impelled to throw up his hat and yell, "Huzzah!" So, now I'll give you Moran's description of what happened. Moran's description of what it's like to be in that mob scene trying to get through the tunnel. Now they have laid out the guy. The original group of 30 guys go through, and the last guy, he's got the orders to seal up the hole, send them more. Well, that's not, he sees that's not happening. There's a giant mob scene, so he just says, "You're on your own," and he goes through himself. So now there's this huge mob, and so this is Lieutenant Moran's description of what happens to him. When I neared the stove, I was nearly suffocated, but I took heart when I saw but 3 men between me and the hole. At this moment, some idiot on the edge of the mob startled us with a cry, "The guards, the guards!" A total panic ensued, and the entire crowd bounded towards the stairway leading up to the sleeping quarters. The stairway was unbanistered, and some of the men were forced off the edge and fell on those beneath. I was taken off my feet, dashed to the floor senseless, my head and one of my hands bruised and cut, my shoulder painfully injured by the boots of the men who rushed over me. They rushed forward, falling over kettles, skillets, pots, and stovepipes, making such a tremendous noise that one might have mistaken it for an earthquake. Then it got quiet. All the noise had ceased upstairs, and I concluded this is Moran, I concluded it was a false alarm. I crept cautiously to the front door and I looked out. A sentinel at that moment was looking toward the door through which I was watching him. He was less than 8 feet away, and he appeared to be looking straight into my eyes. I did not move, fearing to betray my presence by the slightest motion. They play a lot with something a lot of modern people don't know about, which is if you stay in a super darkened area for at least half an hour, your vision improves. And somebody entering that will not be able to see, and you will be able to see. It takes almost half an hour for that to happen, which never occurs to modern humans. But it was very common then. And so sometimes the guards would come, and the guys describe, literally the guard would come and look, and the guy's standing there, the guard looking right at him, and he knows he doesn't see him. If he doesn't move, he sits there, because he's really underdone. So, it says the guard came up, made no response whatever, lazily turning on his heel, slowly crossed the street and disappeared. My belief was confirmed that notwithstanding the unearthly racket, the Confederates had no suspicion of our dangerous game. So
you said that the livery stable during the day was being used, right?
yes, so this is only at night.
So during the day, didn't people in the livery stable see this hole or something?
They hadn't gotten the hole yet. I mean, they only got once, they got the hole through, and then the next night, they covered it over, there was all kind of crap, just a little hole. And this was they literally put some bunch of, stuff like that and covered the hole, and nobody would see it, and nobody noticed it. So then the second night, they start going out. Roses first, all these guys, they slip down one at a time, and what they do is, like I say, they come down, they come through this way, they come across this way, they climb up here, they go into this building, they come out here, and then they turn this way. The guard is assigned to walk this way, come to here, turn on his heel, walk back. So they watch him, he walks back, they come out. Now, this is another amazing event, part of this story that you can't make up. In the Civil War, there were things made. It's amazing how they had mail between the North and South. It's pretty amazing that it went on so well through the war. And the Northerners would ship to the prisoners what they called boxes. And you could get a box, and they just stuff it with food and socks or anything you could think of to help these guys, because they're starving to death. They would write, the Confederates would say, "Hey, why don't you just write home and get some food? We're not giving you enough food to live. So why don't you write north and have them send you some warm clothing too?" Because we stole all the clothing that they sent down for the prisoners and gave it to the Confederates, which means everybody in Richmond is wearing blue clothes, blue uniforms by this time of the war. Because they're better than the Confederate uniforms that are all worn out. So the Confederates, to make life extra miserable for the prisoners, if any anything would happen, they would use that as an excuse to not deliver the boxes. And they would let them pile up in that building where it says number 18, and in here. And they could see out there the food that could save their lives, but the Confederates wouldn't let them have it. And other Confederates would break into the boxes and steal anything they could. They'd steal the food, they'd steal anything they had. So these guys, these guards, think that's what's happening. They think that these people that are coming out of this building, the occasional ones they spot, are just utter Confederates robbing the prisoners. So they don't do anything.
What do they do with the dirt?
You have to wait to the end for that. Okay. So, but, if you can believe it, it takes all night. 109 guys get out. And,
Wow.
this is a major street. This street right here is called Carey Street, still today, but back then it was a major street in Richmond. So this is the 20th Street over here, 21st Street here. So they would come out here, walk up 21st Street, walk down Carey Street, which was, Richmond at this time had gas lighting. I don't think it was up very high, but they had it. And it was shops. And so these men, 109 of them, all in ones and twos and threes individually, could maneuver through this area, and none of them are caught. The Confederates, they're just normal guys. Everybody looks terrible. Everybody's scarred. Everybody has blue, has beat up blue uniforms.
Wow.
So nobody notices. They go through, they join, they talk about joining groups of Confederates. There's all these great stories in there. Again, these first-person accounts are better than I'm even saying. That one guy who had a big beard, he said he looked kind of sick, so he gets with a friend, and he just kept coughing. He said everybody was like concerned, but they all got out of their way, and they let him. Other people tried other things, and then they worked. One guy describes he's one of the last persons to get out after the city, quiets down and gets later at night. He says, I'm sorry. Okay, so this guy describes how he comes out through the door. A sentry called post number 6, all is well. As he came out, he turned his back on me, and I ducked around the corner to freedom. Free, rid of the shackles that had held us so long, we breathed deep draughts of night air and shouted, thank God, free at last. From the bottom of our hearts, we resolved to die rather than return to that dungeon. Out of this hellhole as fast as possible to the land of freedom. And away we went, double quick. We jumped fences, we crashed across gardens, raced down boulevards, bustled through alleys, and started dogs that barked at us. So all of them got out their own way. Then the next thing they had to do was get out of the, they're in the rebel capital. They're out of the prison, but this is just the beginning. They have to cross now. There's extensive earthworks around Richmond. As you know, the defenses in depth that went on and on and on. But there's almost nobody there. The Confederates, the living Confederates, are all on the front line. They don't have a lot of guys sitting around in the trenches doing nothing. And the guys who are sitting there, they're looking that way. These guys are coming this way. So they see the guards who have little fighters and stuff, maneuver through the fight, maneuver through the soldiers, try to get around, and get out. And so, I'd say 108. One guy does get sort of captured out in that way. We don't exactly know what happened to him. But 108 out of 109 is pretty good. They all head out across the countryside. Next day, Confederates show up for another boring day in a prison. The count is late. It takes forever. They're really good at screwing up the count. Like all they have to do is screw with the heads with the minds of the guards. Say the count, they duck, they get in a line, get counted, duck down, get behind, get counted again. They're doing this all the time. They got to disguise 109 people in this, where they can't do it. Eventually the Confederates figure it out. It takes hours. They put all the prisoners in one place and take them out one at a time to get a final count. And when they realize that these guys are missing, they go completely, they can't figure it out. They don't even know what happened. General Winder, you might know him, he was one of the major leaders of the Confederacy. He's in charge of prisons. He's just a few blocks away in his office. He comes down, he's pissed. He orders all the guards arrested. He figures they must have been bribed. They must be in on it. There's no other way this could happen. So they spend the whole afternoon trying to figure out what is going on. And where did these guys go? As one of my guys said, they queried all the inmates about what happened to these men, but nobody knew. So they couldn't help them. So, but here's another good story. Again, you can't make this stuff up. In Richmond, while all this craziness is going on, horses are riding up, and these guys are loving this. They're looking at, when they see horses running back and forth, people yelling, church bells clanging, soldiers going off, they think this is the most fun ever. And elsewhere, another part of Richmond, this is an article from the Richmond Examiner. This is their version of the story. There's a bunch of guys playing illegal poker game in a building, and everybody's searching for the prisoners. So everybody's running around, guards everywhere. They don't know what the commotion is, but they know we should get out of here. So they decide to take off, and they don't go downstairs where the guards have come in. They decide, well, we just go up on the roof and go to the next building. So meanwhile, while this is happening, according to the Examiner, the report spread that Colonel A.D. Strait, now I'm sorry I missed to mention A.D. Strait, he's the most prominent prisoner in the prison. He had led a raid into the Confederacy that burned a lot of Confederate facilities, and even worse, to the Confederacy, he was accused of trying to raise a Negro regiment, as they called it, for which the penalty was death. So the Confederates said they were going to execute him for trying to recruit blacks to join the Union Army. So they really hated this guy, and there's some stories about that. But Elizabeth Van Lew, she made sure he got out. That was the most important person to her to get out of it, was because he was such an anti-slavery abolitionist. So anyway, meanwhile, there's a report spread that Colonel A.D. Strait and several of his officers were in that house. Hundreds of excited citizens rushed to the spot, and in 5 minutes the house was surrounded. This is where the poker game was happening. Watching the car party flee as the men leapt from roof to roof seemed to confirm all the rumors. Quote, the cry arose on all sides, there they go, there's Straits, shoot him, shoot him. The armed citizens began to fire at the running figures with what the Examiner described as their, quote, plug ugly revolvers. Enthusiastic citizens got the range of the man they imagined to be Strait and, quote, blazed away at him as he dodged between two chimneys. But the excited marksmen did not see Strait. They loved that pun. Or shut both their eyes, and they missed him, but they wounded a chimney severely. Finally, after a lapse of about an hour, people regained their senses. The incident dramatized the eagerness to nab Strait. So, now they're out. Now what are they going to do? They got to get across. Of course, they have many pictures for this. But here's what they've got to do.
Did he get straight away?
I can't tell you. Yeah, it hasn't happened yet. You got to wait. Like my wife and I always laugh. When you're in 8th grade, remember they always tell you at the end of your book report, you always say, if you want to know how it ends, you have to read for yourself. But no, I'll be happy to tell you. But anyway, here we are, Richmond, D.C. It's how close they are. It's amazing. York River, but here's the James River, right? So these guys have to get to Williamsburg, where the Union Army is here, right? Down from Richmond. And there's the Chickahominy River in a way. So this is the 50 miles they have to get. It's not very well populated. It's swampy. It's freezing cold. It's barely above freezing. They have no food. They have no warm clothes. They're lucky if they have shoes. They're being pursued by every white person in Virginia, who are also using dogs to try to get them and anything they possibly can. The whole city places alarm. However, this is also slave country. These are plantations all along here. You can even go visit them today. They don't talk about this story, but you can go visit them. And when these men set out across, they can only travel at night, too, so they have to lay on the ground, hide during the day as they're freezing and starving, because they'll be spotted. They can't build fires, they'll be spotted. They're so desperate that they'll do anything, and they do. And so what happens, and this happens repeatedly, it's just fascinating, they finally, when they get really desperate, they say, our only hope And they're all traveling in ones and twos and threes, so they all have their own stories. But, you know, their only plan is head east. Look for the North Star, head east. That's all they have to go by. So, and then you'll eventually get there. But they get so desperate and so starving that they decide they have to get some help, somebody. And so they literally, in numerous cases, many, more than numerous, they start approaching slaves. Now, there's not a plan, and they're all doing it individually. They start approaching enslaved people, and they always, but most of the stories are similar. They come up and say, oh, these guys come walking out of the woods to some guy who's there tilling the field, and they come up to him and they say, I'm a lost traveler. Could you help me out? Give me directions, and you're going to give me some food. And in almost every instance, the slave says, I think you're one of them escaped prisoners. You can't fool me. So the prisoners are like, how is it possible? How is it possible that this guy knows about this escape before I got here? There's no other way to, you know, how do you send information? There's no telegraph in this area. There's no other way to do it except by, but the slave network obviously is so perfect and so extensive that they know about this before the guys show up. And when the guys show up, in every recorded instance, these slaves drop what they're doing and help these guys and risk their own lives. So there are just many, many stories like this. I really wish I could have gotten the slave version, but as you know, by law, they were illiterate. But the soldiers all talk about it because it's so important to them. Now, here's just one account by a Lieutenant Earl, who's a combat experienced officer who obviously, from reading his account, has serious PTSD, and he's only 19 by this. He's been through serious combat, been a prisoner. So he says, finding out our strength was becoming exhausted, we planned to approach a farmhouse and confiscated a chicken, which we intended to eat raw. While we were reconnoitering the outbuildings of a farmhouse, we were discovered by a Negro. He knew at once we were Yankee officers escaped from prison, but he gave us such an assurance of sympathy that we trusted him at once. We were taken immediately to his cabin and were soon before a blazing fire. A guard of colored people were posted to prevent surprise, and the mother of the family began to prepare us something to eat. How the pones of cornbread shaped in the old granny's hands disappeared, and how delicious was that meat. I have always thought it was stolen expressly for us from the slaveholders' pantry. We were thoroughly warmed and well-fed and started out with new courage and definite directions regarding our route. And another officer has this observation, which is very interesting, where it has a similar experience. He says, quote, what intuition or knowledge of forethought was it that told this ignorant old man that his visitor was an escaped Yankee prisoner? But such seems to be the case. And it is a fact that the Negroes of the South were thoroughly alive to their situation and stood ready at all times, even at the risk of their lives, to aid Northern soldiers. Held in bondage though they were for 200 years, they are religiously devoted to our institutions and the land of their birth. It is hoped that these facts will be taken into account and thrown into the scale in the Negro's favor when an adjustment of the race problem comes, as it must.
Great.
So, and finally I'll tell this. As you say, I'm racing through this, because there's much, much more to tell, but I do want to get to the last part, which is Colonel Strait, again, the guy that Elizabeth Van Lew likes, and the Confederates particularly hate, with a few of his guys. They don't escape. They're put up in a safe house by Elizabeth Van Lew, and they sit there. They're supposed to escape, but Elizabeth Van Lew is out doing her thing, and she doesn't get the word of the night of the escape, because they weren't sure when they were going to break through, so she doesn't get the word. She's out helping her cousin who's trying to defect from the Confederate Army. So she comes back, And he says, as she comes back home, the escape has happened, there's all this excitement. And one of her servants comes up and says, as soon as he called, he said there was great trouble and excitement, that many prisoners had escaped during the night, and that some had come to this servant's door and begged to come in, but he was afraid they were not prisoners, only people in disguise to betray us, and he would not let them in. We knew there was to be an exit and had been told to prepare, and had one of our parlors, we had dark blankets nailed up at the windows, and the gas had been kept burning and very low. We were ready for them. We had beds prepared in there. I returned home after going as quickly as I could in despair. But they found them, they put them in this safe house, kept them, they were in the safe house for 5 days while all the other men were on this big escape. And Elizabeth Van Loo, through her network, made sure that the northern newspapers reported Strait and his command are all safe. They made it to Washington. So the Confederates quit looking for them. They're still in Richmond. The next night, they take off on their own, and they go distant, which is, they got to cross. These rivers are frozen with ice, flowing ice. They got to cross this river, this river, this river, this river, this river, to get to the north. And they have an incredible series of their own adventures, but they do. They get away. They get back north. They escape. So in the end, everybody always asks me this. I always like to make people wait to the end of the book to find out. But everybody wants to know. Out of the 109, a little over 60 to 65 escape. Successfully get away. And this is important. These guys, they didn't go home they did go home, but they soon after were back in the front line. So to get 65 dedicated, experienced frontline officers back in action is a great help to the Union. And some of them were later killed in action. And at least one of them has the incredible satisfaction that he describes of marching into Richmond and marching his command up to the prison. And Lincoln comes down right after when Richmond falls. One of the first places he goes to Libby, and the crowd, there's a huge crowd there, they're all yelling, and they say, let's tear it down, we'll tear it down. He says, no, let's leave it as a monument. So,
Wow.
that's the basic end of the story. As best I can do, I'm trying, like I say, to me, I'm really racing through this, but I know it's a little long to you, but that's the end of the story. You could just imagine the accounts they have of the guys who get away. They're basically like, this is a supreme moment of my entire life. This moment where I crossed from life to death.
Did it hit the newspapers soon after?
Immediately.
Because
the Richmond newspapers were all over this. The Richmond newspapers were saying, this is the most amazing escape that's ever happened. They just couldn't believe it.
No, but I mean in the north, you said you get
Oh, yeah.
some officers back. I think it would have been more valuable for the morale of the north.
Oh, it was. No, it got huge coverage. That's why it became the Libby Prison Museum. Everybody knew this story.
Oh, yeah.
Here was an uplifting story. Civil War is, 2 rows of guys get there and blow each other to pieces, spend, shooting each other to pieces. Here's a story of, luck and pluck and heroism where they escape and they survive. It was a very uplifting, positive story that people enjoyed, and that's why there's all these accounts. Like I mentioned, I found 50 first-person accounts that this is based on, and they're all in the book. And they're just really great. But I took me 20 years to find them, but I did. But that's because these Yankees, they all went home. So there's an account in Ypsilanti, and there's another account in Maine, and there's another account in Michigan. And I had to try to find these things, and it was difficult. The internet helped me later when they started posting stuff.
And what was Lincoln's one question at the end?
All right, everybody always says, and it happened in Richmond too, people always say, well, what did they do with the dirt? And I always get to say, that's what Lincoln asked. And they met with Lincoln in the White House. That's what the guy described as Lincoln's first question to them when they talked about it. It's so funny, these accounts, they'll say things like, this escape was so big that I have many of these Civil War accounts. They'll say, yeah, I was in the Civil War, I was in this campaign, it was this battle, this battle. Now I'm going to tell you about Libby. And that's like 40 pages. And the opening was one page.
Do we know what he did with it? Yeah, do we know? what they did?
Bracknell was such a dump. We just had to throw it on the ground. It already was covered with straw, rats, and dirt, so that was actually a non-problem. Which was luckily, another lucky, one of these amazing lucky things that happened for these guys. It just wasn't an issue, it never came up.
The guys who were caught,
Yeah.
were they punished severely?
Yeah, they were put in these horrible dungeons in the basement, as if things weren't bad enough. Now they had to sit on the floor in this dungeon, on the bottom floor, basically no light. It would get cold enough at night that the bucket of water they had would freeze. And they bread and water. And, but they survived. They went back to the prison, eventually. These things are arbitrary. That this guy Turner, who was a crazy man, was also very arbitrary. And he just, okay, I let them all back. It's all over, they're back, that kind of thing would happen. No? No, nobody was, there were many stories that 2 guys drowned, but I don't believe them because I never could find their names or what happened. I never could get any data about 2 guys that didn't make it. So therefore, I'm of the belief that everybody either got away or was recaptured and put back in the prison. And
Amazing.
so in the last part of the whole book is all this cat and mouse and the guys who got away and the guys who didn't. It's the definition of hairbreadth escapes that these guys had. They had to deal with Mosby, his men were out looking for him, everybody was looking for him. But the slaves really helped him. And,
Would they start writing these like in journals in the prison?
yes, guys would write about it and they would stuff them into their shoes, pieces of paper, and take them out. This guy, Frederick Cavada, that I was telling you about, who did all the drawing, he published a book before the war was over about what happened, and then he even has to sort of disguise things, because he knows the Confederates might read it. Now, other accounts, and this happens when you're a military or you're an historian of any sort, like I am, when you read first-person accounts, as people get further away, everything gets softer and nicer.
Yeah.
So they get, oh yeah, it was bad. I don't even know how we survived. It was pretty awful. As opposed to the guys who just got out, they're furious. They're really angry. That this happened. Another result I could go is Andersonville is one of the results. It was already being contemplated, but when this escape happened, they really accelerated. And Andersonville being the point that they decided, it wasn't very smart for us to put thousands and thousands of Union prisoners in the capital. Maybe we should put them out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
And then we can just ignore them and then they can all die out there.
Right.
They can starve to death and nobody will notice. So that's what they did. And Libby Prison after this just became, it functioned throughout the war, it became just a holding tank. So a lot of soldiers were in Libby, but only for a few days, say, during that later period. And the earlier period where guys would come in and they'd be exchanged and go home. It was really in 63, 64, beginning of 60, that they were really held there and not let out. That they couldn't go anywhere. Yes.
Doug, where can people get your book?
Oh yeah! The book's available. It's popular. It's $20. I take the tax. $20 here. Everybody's got. If you want to get it, enjoy it. Then you can tell me what you think.
Yes.
I forgot my last couple of pictures. They're straight. That's a picture of straight. I forgot to say, this was considered corpulent. So he got stuck in a tunnel. He had to back out and take his clothes off to get out of the tunnel and the actual escape. And they were all saying, a fat man got caught in the tunnel. Just like one of the guys says, there are so many people in this prison. You got doctors and lawyers and actors and writers and farmers. And we even have a guy, if you can believe it, we even have a guy that's 55 years old in here. Wow. You're talking ancient. This is a cool picture I also want to show you. Look at this guy. Look at this shot. This is in the corner of the prison.
Oh, yeah.
These are the prisoners. You can see them in the windows. These are the guards down below.
Nobody shot him.
Pretty amazing picture there. And And this, here's another amazing picture for all of us. You know, Alfred Woad, who was the best artist of the Civil War, the best quarter artist, sketch artist, you know. This is his sketch of Libby after the Union occupation. It's got a Union flag up there. These are Confederate prisoners. So this is his drawing at the very end of the war in Richmond with Confederate prisoners, with ladies coming by to check, and then here's the guards. Anyway, that's a very interesting picture, and I just thought I'd end with Elizabeth Van Loon. She had a hard life in Richmond because she was so despised by everybody, and but she still had a mansion. She had no money, especially after she lost her postmistress job. She lived to 1900 when she passed away. Not a single white person would come to her funeral. It was called the nigger funeral. Wow. And she was buried in an unmarked grave. She had no money. So.
She didn't get a union pension for being
Yeah, well, the pension was like the job for a while, and then I think she did get some money, but she didn't really survive. She had, you know, during the Civil War, you want another side thing, one of the main things she was so brilliant about, she understood how to exploit the Confederate system like nobody else. And that meant she had to keep her people slaves. She wanted to freedom, but they didn't want to leave Richmond. They didn't want to leave Virginia. So they stayed slaves. They could go. She could do all kinds of things with people who were slaves that she couldn't do with free people. Wow. For instance, free white men were not allowed to wander around Richmond. You could be accosted by a soldier. Why aren't you in the army? Why aren't you on a work crew? What are you doing? You got to justify yourself. All men had to sign a loyalty oath to the Confederacy. No women. Because women aren't going to be a problem. They're all loyal, right? So women didn't have to sign a loyalty oath. And Elizabeth Van Loon knew that if she wanted to check someplace out, she'd send a slave there with paperwork, and nobody would bother them. They could go anywhere. Women could go anywhere, and slaves could go anywhere as long as they had the paperwork, where white men couldn't go. So it's a very interesting dynamic that she was exploiting to get what she wanted. And so this is so the ladies of Boston, as they say, heard about her and raised money to put up this stone in one of the main cemeteries in Richmond. And it says on it, it's great. It says, she risked everything. I think she's such a hero, I get excited. She risked everything that is dear to man. Friends, fortune, comfort, health, life itself. All for the one absorbing desire of her heart, that slavery might be abolished and the Union preserved.
Wow.
So, anyway.
Oh, yeah.